The mountain man's shadow stretched long across the failing garden when he first saw her kneeling between the withered rows, her shoulders shaking with sobs that seemed to rise from somewhere deep within her soul. Adler Harlow had been traveling through Iowa territory for 3 weeks, making his way down from the Dakota hills with nothing but his horse, his rifle, and the kind of solitude that suited a man who had spent the better part of 5 years in the wilderness. The year was 1852, and Council Bluffs was supposed to be just another stop on his journey south, a place to resupply before winter set in hard. He had not expected to find anything in this settlement that would make him want to stay, but then he saw her there among the dead plants, and something in his chest tightened in a way he had not felt in years. The woman wore a faded blue dress that had been mended so many times the patches had patches, and her dark hair had come loose from its pins, falling in tangled waves down her back. She did not seem to notice him standing at the edge of what must have been her property, did not hear the soft snort of his horse or the creak of leather as he shifted in his saddle. She was too consumed by her grief, her hands pressed against the dry earth as if she could will life back into the soil through sheer desperation. Adler dismounted quietly, tying his horse to a fence post that looked about as sturdy as the crops looked healthy, which was to say not very. He was a large man, standing well over 6 feet with shoulders broad enough to block out the sun, and his buckskin clothing marked him clearly as someone who lived far from civilization. His dark hair hung past his shoulders, tied back with a leather cord, and his face bore the weathered look of a man who had seen both the beauty and brutality of the frontier. Muscles corded his arms and chest from years of hard living, of chopping wood and hauling water and doing whatever needed doing to survive in places where survival was never guaranteed. He approached slowly, not wanting to startle her, but his boots crunched on the dried earth loud enough that she finally looked up. Her face was streaked with tears and dirt, her eyes red and swollen, and for a moment she just stared at him with the blank expression of someone who had cried themselves past the point of caring who saw them in such a state. "Madam," he said, removing his wide-brimmed hat and holding it against his chest. "I do not mean to intrude, but are you all right?" It was perhaps the stupidest question he could have asked, given the circumstances, but it was what came out. She let out a sound that was half laugh, half sob, and shook her head. "Do I look all right to you?" she asked, her voice hoarse and broken. "Does any of this look all right?" She gestured around at the garden, at the rows upon rows of withered plants that should have been thriving in the late summer heat, but instead looked like they had given up on life entirely. The corn stalks were brown and brittle, the potato plants had shriveled to nothing, and the beans that should have been climbing their poles had died before they even had a chance to flower. It was a devastating sight, the kind that meant the difference between eating through the winter and starving before spring arrived. "What happened?" Adler asked, crouching down beside her so he was not towering over her quite so much. Up close, he could see that she was younger than he had first thought, probably no more than 22 or 23, with a face that would have been pretty if it had not been marked by such profound sadness. "Everything," she said, fresh tears spilling down her cheeks. "The seeds I planted in the spring were bad, I think. Or maybe the soil is cursed. Or maybe I am just not meant to survive out here. Nothing grew right from the start, and then the drought came, and now there is nothing. I have nothing." She pressed her hands to her face, and her whole body shook with the force of her crying. Adler felt something twist in his gut, an unfamiliar urge to fix this, to make it better somehow. He had spent so long alone in the mountains, so long focused only on his own survival, that he had almost forgotten what it felt like to care about another person's troubles. But there was something about this woman, Something about her determination to keep kneeling in that dead garden as if refusing to give up even when everything was lost, that reached past all his carefully constructed walls. "What is your name?" he asked gently. She lowered her hands and looked at him with red-rimmed eyes. Clara Caldwell. Miss Caldwell, I am Adler Harlow, and I have been farming mountain land for 5 years now. I know a thing or two about coaxing plants out of stubborn soil." He looked around at her garden again, his experienced eyes taking in details she probably had not even noticed. "This is not a lost cause. Not yet." "Yes, it is," Clara said flatly. "It is almost September. Even if I had good seeds, there is not enough time left in the season to grow anything substantial. I will starve this winter." "Not if we plant the right things," Adler said. He stood up, offering her his hand. She stared at it for a long moment as if she could not quite believe it was real, then took it and let him pull her to her feet. Her hand was small and calloused in his, the hand of someone who worked hard even if her efforts had not paid off this year. "There are fast-growing crops, things that can handle the coming cold better than what you tried to grow. And I have seeds with me, good seeds that I know will take. I was going to plant them at my winter camp, but I think they would be better used here." Clara's eyes widened. "You would do that?" "For a stranger? Why not?" Adler said, though he was asking himself the same question. He had not come to Council Bluffs looking to help anyone. He had not come looking for anything except supplies and a night or two in a real bed before heading back into the wilderness. But now that he was here, now that he had seen Clara kneeling in her ruined garden with tears streaming down her face, he found that leaving was the last thing he wanted to do. "I have the seeds and you have the land. Seems like it would be wasteful not to try." She studied his face as if searching for some hidden motive, some reason why a mountain man would stop to help a woman he had never met before. Adler kept his expression open and honest, because he genuinely did not have any ulterior motives beyond a strange compulsion to make sure this woman did not spend the winter hungry and alone. "I cannot pay you," Clara said quietly. "I have almost no money, and what little I have needs to go toward flour and salt and the other things I cannot grow." "I am not asking for payment," Adler said. "Consider it a gift. Or if you cannot accept it as a gift, then consider it an investment in the community. Council Bluffs will be better off with one less person starving, will it not?" A tiny smile flickered across Clara's face, gone almost before it appeared. "I suppose that is true." She hesitated, then nodded. "All right. If you really have seeds to spare and time to help me plant them, then yes. I would be grateful, more grateful than I can say." "Then let us get started," Adler said. "We are losing daylight and we have a lot of work to do." He went back to his horse and pulled down his saddlebags, digging through them until he found the leather pouch where he kept his seed stores. He had turnips and radishes, both of which could go from seed to harvest in a matter of weeks if the conditions were right. He had kale and spinach, hardy greens that would actually taste better after a frost. And he had winter wheat, which could be planted in the fall and would lie dormant under the snow before sprouting in spring. It was not the abundant harvest that Clara had been hoping for with her original crops, but it would be enough to see her through until next year. Clara led him to a small shed behind her cabin where she kept her gardening tools. The cabin itself was tiny, just one room with a stone chimney and a roof that looked like it needed repairs before the snow came. Adler filed that information away for later, already mentally calculating how long it would take him to patch the weak spots he could see from where he stood. They worked together as the sun began its descent toward the horizon, pulling up the dead plants and turning over the soil. Clara's garden was not large, maybe a quarter acre at most, but the soil was in rough shape, compacted and depleted. Adler sent Clara to fetch water while he worked his knife through the earth, breaking up the hardest clods and mixing in composted material from a pile he found near the shed. "You keep good compost," he observed when Clara returned with 2 heavy buckets hanging from a yoke across her shoulders. "That will help. My father taught me," Clara said, setting down the buckets with a grunt of relief. "He said good compost was the backbone of any successful garden. I just wish he were here to tell me where I went wrong with this year's planting." "Where is he?" Adler asked, though he suspected he already knew the answer. People did not end up alone on the frontier without reason. "Dead," Clara said simply. "Cholera took both my parents 2 years ago, along with half the settlement. I was 19 and suddenly on my own with nothing but this cabin and this land. I have been trying to make it work, but this year was the first time everything failed so completely. Last year I at least got enough to eat, even if there was not much left over." Adler nodded, not offering empty condolences. He had lost people too, had seen enough death on the frontier to know that sometimes there were no words that could make it better. Instead, he just kept working, his strong hands moving efficiently through the soil, preparing it for the new seeds. They planted as the light faded, working by feel as much as by sight. Adler showed Clara the proper depth for each type of seed, the right spacing, the techniques he had learned through trial and error in the mountains where the growing season was even shorter than it was here in Iowa territory. She was a quick learner, her hands moving with increasing confidence as she understood what he was teaching her. "These turnips will be ready in 40 days if the weather holds," Adler explained as they moved down a row together. "The radishes even sooner, maybe 30 days. The greens you can start harvesting as soon as they are big enough to eat, and they will keep growing back as long as the frost does not get too hard." "And the wheat?" Clara asked, gesturing to the section they had set aside for that particular crop. "The wheat will sit through winter and come up in spring. You will harvest it next summer, but it will be worth the wait. A good stand of wheat can keep you fed for a year if you are careful with it." They finished planting just as full darkness fell, their hands filthy and their backs aching. Adler straightened up with a groan, pressing his fist into the small of his back, and Clara laughed softly beside him. "You make the same sound my father used to make after a long day in the garden," she said. "That is because gardening is hard work, no matter how strong you are," Adler replied. He looked around at what they had accomplished, satisfaction settling warm in his chest. The garden was no longer a graveyard of failed dreams but a space full of potential, ready to produce the food Clara would need to survive. "You should water everything well tonight and then again in the morning. After that, keep the soil moist but not soaked. The seeds will do the rest." Clara nodded, but she was looking at him rather than at the garden. "Will you stay for supper?" "It is not much, just beans and cornbread from my last batch of flour, but it seems wrong to send you away hungry after everything you have done." Adler knew he should say no. He had already delayed his journey by several hours, and he still needed to find a place to make camp for the night. But his stomach rumbled at the mention of food, and more than that, he found he was not ready to leave Clara's company. There was something peaceful about being around her, something that made the constant restlessness he usually felt in settlements seem less pressing. "I would like that," he said. "Thank you." Clara's cabin was as spare on the inside as it had looked from the outside. One rope bed in the corner, a small table with 2 chairs, a cookstove that had seen better days, and shelves lined with nearly empty jars and containers. But it was clean and tidy, and Clara moved around the space with the efficiency of someone who knew exactly where everything was, even in the dim light of a single oil lamp. She reheated the beans and fried up cornbread in a skillet while Adler washed his hands in a basin by the door. When she set the food on the table, he saw that she had given him nearly twice as much as she had taken for herself. He frowned at that but did not comment, instead eating slowly and making sure she finished her own plate before he accepted her offer of seconds. They ate in comfortable silence for a while, both too tired and hungry for much conversation. But when the meal was finished and Clara poured them each a cup of weak coffee, Adler found himself asking, "Why did you stay? After your parents died, I mean. You must have had other options." Clara wrapped her hands around her coffee cup, staring down into the dark liquid. "I did. I have an aunt in Philadelphia who wrote and said I could come live with her. But that would have meant giving up the land, giving up everything my parents worked for, and I just could not do it. This cabin, this garden, it is all I have left of them. If I leave, it feels like they will be gone completely." "So you stayed and tried to make it work on your own," Adler said. "I stayed and failed," Clara corrected. "At least that is how it feels right now." "You did not fail," Adler said firmly. "You had bad luck with your seeds and the weather did not cooperate, but you did not give up. You are still out there today, still kneeling in that garden even though it looked hopeless. That is not failure. That is the kind of determination that gets people through hard times." Clara's eyes filled with tears again, but these seemed different from the desperate sobs he had witnessed earlier. "I do not feel determined. I feel exhausted." "Those two things are not as different as you might think," Adler said. "Some of the most determined people I have known were also the most tired. Determination is not about never feeling like you want to quit. It is about showing up anyway." She smiled at that, a real smile this time that lit up her whole face despite the tear tracks still visible on her cheeks. "You are not what I expected when I first saw you standing at the edge of my garden." "What did you expect?" Adler asked, genuinely curious. "I do not know." "Someone gruff and distant, I suppose. Mountain men have a certain reputation for being unfriendly to civilization." "That reputation is not entirely unearned," Adler admitted. "Most of us head into the mountains because we do not fit well with people. But that does not mean we have forgotten how to be decent when the situation calls for it." "Why did you go into the mountains?" Clara asked. "If you do not mind me asking." Adler considered the question, debating how much to share. He was not used to talking about himself, about the reasons he had left his old life behind. But something about Clara made him want to open up, to let her see past the rough exterior to the man underneath. "I was a farmer once, back in Missouri," he said finally. "Had a wife and a little homestead and plans for the future. But she died giving birth to our son, and the baby died with her. After that, I could not stand to be in that place anymore, surrounded by reminders of everything I had lost. So I sold the land and headed west, kept going until I was so far into the mountains that I did not have to think about any of it anymore." Clara reached across the table and placed her hand over his. "I am so sorry. I cannot imagine losing someone like that." "It was 5 years ago," Adler said. "Time helps, or at least people say it does. Mostly I just learned to live with it, to keep moving forward because staying still hurt too much." "Is that why you travel? Why you do not settle down somewhere?" "Partly," Adler said, "though I have a cabin up in the Dakota hills where I spend winters. It is just easier to be alone, I think. No risk of losing anyone else if you do not let anyone get close." Clara nodded slowly, her hand still resting on his. "I understand that. After my parents died, I told myself I was better off alone, safer somehow, but lonely, very lonely." They sat like that for a long moment, hands touching across the table. Two people who had both learned the hard way that the frontier took more than it gave, but who were still somehow trying to make a life out of what remained. Finally, Adler cleared his throat and gently pulled his hand back. I should probably find a place to make camp for the night. Is there a spot near town where travelers usually set up? You could stay here, Clara said quickly, then blushed. I mean in the shed. There is room and it would be more comfortable than sleeping on the ground. Adler hesitated. Every instinct told him to maintain his distance, to thank her for the offer and ride away before this connection between them grew into something more complicated. But another part of him, a part that had been silent for 5 long years, wanted to stay. Wanted to see what would happen if he let himself care about someone again. All right, he said. Thank you, I will take you up on that. Clara's face brightened and she stood to clear the dishes. I will get you some blankets. The nights are getting cold already. While she rummaged through a trunk for spare bedding, Adler carried the dishes outside to wash them at the pump. The night air was crisp and clear. Stars scattered across the sky in a brilliant display that he never got tired of seeing. He could hear the Missouri River in the distance, its constant whisper a reminder of how many people pass through this place on their way to somewhere else. Council Bluffs was a jumping-off point for the Oregon Trail, a last stop before the real wilderness began. It occurred to him that he should be one of those people, passing through on his way to somewhere else. But as he dried the dishes on a rag Clara had given him and carried them back inside, he found himself thinking about how long it would take for those turnip seeds to sprout, how Clara's face would look when she saw the first green shoots pushing up through the soil. He wanted to be there to see it. Clara was waiting with an armful of blankets when he came back in. The shed is this way, she said, leading him outside and across the yard. The shed was small but dry, with tools hung neatly on the walls and a clear space on the floor where he could spread out his bedroll. It is not much, but at least you will be out of the wind. It is perfect, Adler assured her. I have slept in far worse places, believe me. She handed him the blankets, her fingers brushing his in the exchange. Thank you again, Adler, for the seeds, for the help, for all of it. I do not know how I can ever repay you. You do not have to repay me, Adler said. Just make sure you eat well this winter. That will be enough. Clara smiled and turned to go, but at the doorway she paused and looked back. Will you still be here in the morning? Or will you be gone before I wake up? It was a fair question. Adler had a reputation for appearing and disappearing like smoke, never staying in one place long enough to put down roots. But looking at Clara silhouetted in the doorway with lamplight glowing behind her, he knew he was not going anywhere just yet. I will be here, he promised. Those plants are going to need tending over the next few days, and I want to make sure they get off to a good start. The relief on Clara's face was so obvious it made his chest ache. Good. That is good. Sleep well, Adler. You too, Clara. He watched her walk back to the cabin, waited until he saw the lamp go out inside before he finally settled down in his makeshift bed. The blankets smelled like cedar and lavender, and they were softer than anything he had used in years. He should have fallen asleep immediately, exhausted from the day of travel and physical labor, but instead he lay awake for a long time, listening to the sounds of the settlement at night and thinking about the woman sleeping alone in the cabin across the yard. He had told himself for 5 years that he was better off alone, that caring for someone was just an invitation for more pain. But Clara had looked at him with such hope when he promised to stay, and he had felt something in himself shift, some frozen part of his heart beginning to thaw. It was terrifying and exhilarating all at once, this feeling of connection, of mattering to someone again. Eventually he did sleep, and when he woke with the dawn he found that Clara was already up and working. She was in the garden with a watering can, moving carefully along the rows they had planted the night before, making sure each section got its share of moisture. She had changed into a work dress, that was only slightly less patched than the one she had been wearing yesterday, and she had braided her hair back in a thick plait that hung down her back. Adler took a moment just to watch her, appreciating the graceful way she moved despite her obvious exhaustion, the determination evident in every careful step. Then he stood and stretched, his joints cracking after a night on the hard floor, and went to join her. "Morning," he said, and Clara jumped slightly, water sloshing from the can. "You are awake," she said, pressing a hand to her chest. "I tried to be quiet. You were. I am just used to waking with the sun." He looked around the garden, checking the soil moisture and the way the morning light fell across the beds. "This looks good. You are doing it exactly right." "I had a good teacher," Clara said. She set down the watering can and rolled her shoulders. "I am making breakfast if you are hungry. It is just porridge and a bit of dried apple, but you are welcome to share it." They walked back to the cabin together, and Adler found himself noticing things he had missed in the dark the night before. The fence that badly needed mending, the wood pile that was far too small for the coming winter, the way the cabin's single window had a crack running through one corner of the glass. Clara was barely getting by, and this year's crop failure could easily have been the thing that pushed her from struggling into genuine disaster. Over breakfast, he asked, "Do you have family anywhere else? Besides the aunt in Philadelphia, I mean. Anyone who helps you out?" Clara shook her head. "My parents were only children, both of them, and my grandparents are all gone. My aunt is truly my only living relative." She stirred her porridge without eating it. "There are neighbors here, of course, and they have been kind in their way, but everyone is busy with their own survival. I cannot expect them to take responsibility for mine." "What about the men in town?" Adler asked, trying to keep his voice casual. "Seems like there would be plenty who would jump at the chance to court a woman with her own land." Clara laughed bitterly. "Oh, there have been offers. But they were all men looking for a piece of property more than a wife. I could feel it in the way they talked, how they would ask about the land before they asked about me. And after my parents died, after I saw how quickly life can be taken away, I promised myself I would not settle for someone who did not really care about me. If I am going to be alone anyway, I would rather be alone on my own terms." Adler understood that more than he wanted to admit. "That is fair. Though I imagine it makes life harder." "Everything about life out here is hard," Clara said. "At least this way I am hard on my own terms." She had spirit, this woman, more than he had initially realized. She might have been crying in her garden when he found her, might have been at the end of her rope, but she had not given up. She had not run back east to her aunt or settled for a marriage of convenience. She was still fighting, still trying to make a life for herself even when everything seemed stacked against her. After breakfast, Adler announced that he was going to spend the day making repairs around the property. Clara protested that she could not ask him to do more, that he had already done enough, but he waved off her objections. "I am here anyway," he said. "Might as well make myself useful." He started with the fence, replacing broken posts and restringing wire where it had come loose. It was satisfying work, the kind of simple physical labor that let his mind wander while his hands stayed busy. Clara tried to help, but he sent her to do other chores, knowing that she had plenty of her own work to catch up on. As the day wore on, Adler found himself settling into a rhythm that felt oddly familiar, like muscle memory from his old life in Missouri. He had almost forgotten what it felt like to work on a homestead, to see the immediate results of his labor in the form of a sturdy fence or a repaired roof. In the mountains, his work was all about survival. Hunt, trap, gather, preserve. It was necessary but solitary. This was different. This was building something, maintaining something, creating a space where life could flourish. Clara brought him water and a simple lunch of bread and cheese around midday, sitting with him in the shade of the cabin while he ate. "You do not have to do all this," she said, but her tone was more resigned than protesting. She had realized by now that he was going to do what he wanted regardless of her objections. "I know," Adler said, "but I want to. It has been a long time since I had a reason to fix things instead of just making do." "What was she like?" Clara asked suddenly. "Your wife?" Adler was quiet for a moment, chewing slowly while he considered how to answer. He had avoided thinking about Mary for so long that it was strange to deliberately bring her to mind. But he found that it did not hurt as much as he expected. The pain was still there, but it had dulled over time into something more like a sad memory than an open wound. "She was kind," he said finally. "Patient. She had red hair that caught fire in the sunlight and she hummed while she worked. Little tuneless songs that drove me crazy sometimes, but in a good way. She loved flowers, kept a whole garden of them even though they served no practical purpose. I used to tease her about it, ask why she was wasting time on things we could not eat. She always said beauty was just as important as food, that a life without pretty things was not worth living." Clara smiled softly. "She sounds wonderful." She was. Adler took a long drink of water. "I have spent 5 years trying not to think about her, about the life we were supposed to have together. Seemed easier that way, but maybe that was the wrong approach. Maybe I should have been remembering the good parts instead of just running from the pain." "Grief is strange," Clara said. "I find myself forgetting what my parents looked like sometimes, and then I feel guilty for forgetting. But then something will remind me, a smell or a sound, and it all comes rushing back so clearly it takes my breath away." "That is exactly it," Adler agreed. He looked at her, this woman who understood loss in the same intimate way he did, and felt that connection between them strengthen. "How do you do it? Keep going, I mean, when it feels like everything has been taken from you." "I do not know," Clara admitted. "I just wake up each morning and do the next thing that needs doing. Feed the chickens, tend the garden, mend my clothes, and then I go to bed and do it all again the next day. It is not much of a life, maybe, but it is mine. That has to count for something." "It counts for a lot," Adler said. "More than you probably realize." They sat together in companionable silence after that, and Adler felt something settle in his chest, something he could not quite name, but that felt like peace. When he went back to work on the fence, Clara returned to her own chores, but he was aware of her presence throughout the afternoon, aware of the way she checked on the garden multiple times, and the way she glanced over at him when she thought he was not looking. By the time the sun began to set, Adler had finished the fence and patched the worst spots in the roof. He had also chopped enough wood to double the size of Clara's supply pile, though it still was not nearly enough for a full winter. That would take days more work, but he found himself thinking that maybe he had days to spare. Clara made supper, a soup she managed to coax into something flavorful despite having very few ingredients to work with. They ate together at the small table again, and this time the conversation flowed more easily, both of them relaxing into each other's company. Clara told him about growing up in Council Bluffs, about watching the town grow as more and more settlers passed through on their way west. Adler told her about his adventures in the mountains, about close calls with bears and harsh winters, and the strange beauty of being the only human for miles in any direction. "You ever get lonely up there?" Clara asked. "All the time," Adler admitted. "But it is a different kind of lonely than being surrounded by people and still feeling alone. In the mountains, the loneliness is honest. There is no pretending." "I think I understand that," Clara said. "Sometimes I am lonelier in town, surrounded by neighbors who are friendly but distant, than I am out here by myself." Then maybe we are both running from the same thing, Adler said. Not people exactly, but the wrong kind of connection. The surface-level kind that does not really mean anything. Clara met his eyes across the table. And what is the right kind of connection? I do not know, Adler said honestly. But I think it is the kind where you can sit in silence without it being awkward, where you can share your pain without being judged, where you help each other not because you have to, but because you want to. That sounds nice, Clara said softly. I would like to find that someday. Adler wanted to say that maybe she already had, that maybe this thing growing between them was exactly that kind of connection. But it felt too soon, too fast, even though part of him recognized that what he felt for Clara had nothing to do with how long he had known her and everything to do with who she was. So instead he just nodded and helped her clear the dishes, and they settled into their evening routine as if they had been doing this for years instead of days. That night, lying in the shed again, Adler made a decision. He was going to stay in Council Bluffs for a while, at least until the first of Clara's crops came in. He told himself it was just about making sure the garden succeeded, about seeing this through to completion, but he knew that was only part of the truth. The larger truth was that he did not want to leave Clara, did not want to go back to his solitary existence in the mountains when he had just rediscovered what it felt like to matter to someone. The next morning, he told Clara his plan over breakfast. She tried to hide her relief, but he could see it in the way her whole body relaxed, in the brightness that came into her eyes. "You do not have to do that," she said, but there was no conviction behind the words. "I know," Adler said, "but I am going to anyway." Over the following days, they fell into a routine. Mornings were for tending the garden, checking for signs of growth, making sure everything had enough water but not too much. Afternoons were for repairs and preparations for winter. Adler worked on building up the wood supply, fixing the window, reinforcing the cabin's walls against the cold that was coming. Clara cooked and mended and did the 1,000 small tasks that kept a homestead running, and in the evenings they talked. They shared stories about their pasts, their dreams for the future, their fears and hopes, and everything in between. Adler found himself opening up in ways he had not done since Mary died, telling Clara things he had never told anyone else. And Clara did the same, revealing the depth of her loneliness and her determination, her secret doubts and her stubborn refusal to give up. 5 days after they had planted the seeds, the first shoots began to appear. Adler was in the garden with Clara when she spotted them, tiny green specks pushing up through the dark soil. She let out a sound that was half laugh, half sob, and dropped to her knees to get a closer look. "They are growing," she said, her voice full of wonder. "Adler, they are actually growing." He knelt beside her, feeling a surge of satisfaction at the sight of those first brave plants. "I told you they would. You just needed the right seeds and the right knowledge." Clara turned to him with tears streaming down her face, but these were happy tears, tears of relief and joy. "Thank you," she said. "Thank you so much. You saved my life." "You would have figured it out," Adler said, but she shook her head. "No, I would have starved this winter, or I would have given up and gone to Philadelphia. Either way, I would not be here. You gave me a reason to stay." Adler reached out and wiped away one of her tears with his thumb, the gesture intimate and tender. "You gave yourself the reason to stay. I just provided some seeds." Clara caught his hand before he could pull it away, holding it against her cheek. "It was more than that. You know it was." He did know. Somewhere in the past few days, this had stopped being about a mountain man helping a stranger in need, and started being about two people finding each other in the midst of their loneliness. Adler was falling for Clara, had maybe already fallen for her, and from the way she was looking at him, he thought she might be feeling the same way. "Clara," he said, his voice rough. "I need you to know I am not good at this, at opening up to people, at letting someone in. I have spent 5 years building walls and they do not come down easy." "I am not asking for easy," Clara said. "I am just asking for honest. Can you give me that?" "Yes," Adler said. "I can give you that." He leaned in slowly, giving her time to pull away if she wanted to, but she did not. Instead, she met him halfway, and when their lips touched, it felt like coming home after a long journey. The kiss was gentle at first, tentative, but then Clara made a small sound in the back of her throat and pressed closer, and Adler wrapped his arms around her, pulling her against his chest. They kissed there in the garden, surrounded by the first signs of new growth, and it felt like a beginning rather than an end. When they finally pulled apart, both breathing hard, Clara rested her forehead against his. "I was not expecting this when I woke up crying in my garden last week," she said. "Neither was I," Adler admitted. "I was just passing through. I was not supposed to stay. But you did. But I did." They stayed in the garden for a while longer, sitting side by side and watching the sun move across the sky, their hands linked together in Clara's lap. Adler felt something in him settle, a restlessness that had driven him for years finally quieting. He had been running for so long, trying to outpace his grief and his guilt, but maybe what he needed was not more distance but the courage to stay in one place, to let himself care again despite the risk. As the weeks passed, the garden flourished. The radishes came up fast, ready to harvest in less than a month. The turnips were not far behind, their greens lush and healthy. The kale and spinach filled in, and Clara picked leaves for their meals with an expression of such profound gratitude that it made Adler's chest ache. The wheat had sprouted 2 tiny green shoots that would lie dormant through the winter, before growing tall next spring. And as the garden grew, so did the connection between Adler and Clara. They worked side by side every day, their movements coordinated in that way that only comes when two people truly know each other. They talked about everything and nothing, comfortable in both conversation and silence. And every night, before Adler retired to the shed, he would kiss Clara good night on her front porch, each kiss lasting a little longer than the last. The people of Council Bluffs noticed, of course. It was impossible to hide something like this in a small settlement where everyone knew everyone else's business. Some of the neighbors came by to check on Clara, eyeing Adler with suspicion, but Clara defended him fiercely. "He has been nothing but kind and helpful," she told Mrs. Patterson, one of the nosier women in town. "I do not know what I would have done without him." "But he is a mountain man, dear," Mrs. Patterson said, as if this explained everything. "They are not the settling down type. He will break your heart and disappear back into the wilderness before winter is out." Clara's jaw tightened. "Adler is a good man, whatever you might think about mountain men in general, and what happens between us is our business, not yours." When she told Adler about the conversation later, he was troubled. "She is not entirely wrong, you know. I have a cabin up north, a life there. I cannot just abandon it." "I am not asking you to abandon it," Clara said, "but I am not asking you to abandon me either. Surely there is some middle ground." Adler pulled her close, pressing a kiss to the top of her head. "I am not going to abandon you. I do not know exactly what the future looks like, but I know you are part of it. We will figure out the details." As October arrived and the air turned crisp with the promise of winter, Adler knew he needed to make a decision. His cabin in the Dakota hills would need to be prepared for winter, his trap lines checked, his supplies laid in. But the thought of leaving Clara, even temporarily, felt wrong in a way he could not quite articulate. Finally, one evening as they sat together after supper, he broached the subject. "I need to go north soon, before the snow flies in earnest." There are things at my cabin that cannot be left unattended." Clara's face fell, but she nodded. "I understand. You have your own life, your own responsibilities." "Come with me," Adler said suddenly. The words were out before he had fully thought them through, but once he said them, he knew they were right. "Come north with me, spend the winter in the mountains." Clara stared at him. "Are you serious?" "Completely serious. My cabin is small, but it is sturdy and well supplied. We could manage together, and in the spring we would come back here to plant your garden again. Unless," he hesitated, "unless you would rather I came back here for the winter instead. I could move my things, make this my home base." "You would do that?" Clara asked. "Give up your mountain cabin for me?" "I would give up more than that for you," Adler said honestly. "These past few weeks with you have been the happiest I have been in 5 years. I do not want to go back to being alone, not if there is another option." Clara's eyes filled with tears, but she was smiling. "I do not want you to give up anything, but I do not think I can leave this place, not permanently. My parents are buried here. Their dreams are here. If I left now, after everything, it would feel like giving up." "Then I will stay," Adler said firmly. "We will winterize this cabin properly, build up enough supplies to see us through, and in the spring I will go collect my things from the north and bring them back here. This will be my home." "Are you sure?" Clara asked. "This is a huge decision." "I am sure," Adler said. "I am more sure about this than I have been about anything in a long time." Clara launched herself at him, wrapping her arms around his neck and kissing him with an intensity that took his breath away. When she pulled back, she was laughing and crying at the same time. "Yes, stay with me. Please stay." "Always," Adler promised. They spent the next few weeks preparing for winter in earnest. Adler took on the heavy work, chopping cords and cords of wood until Clara's supply was larger than it had ever been. He reinforced the cabin's walls with extra mud chinking, sealed every crack and gap that might let in cold air. He laid in supplies from the general store in town, buying flour and sugar and coffee with money he had saved from years of selling furs and pelts. Clara harvested her garden, pulling up radishes and turnips and storing them in the root cellar Adler dug out beneath the cabin. She picked greens and cooked them into meals that tasted like victory, like survival, like hope. And she took apart her parents' old clothing and sewed it into new pieces that would fit Adler, making him a winter coat lined with rabbit fur and thick wool trousers that would keep him warm through the coldest months. As they worked, they talked about the future. About expanding the garden next year, about maybe getting a milk cow if they could save enough money, about building an addition onto the cabin so they would have more room, about the life they were creating together from the ashes of their old lives. One evening in late October, as the first real cold snap arrived, Adler asked Clara to marry him. He had been planning to wait, to make it more formal somehow, but the moment felt right. They were sitting by the fireplace after supper, Clara mending one of his shirts while he carved a new handle for her broken hoe, and he just looked at her and knew he did not want to spend another day without making this official. "Marry me," he said, not even phrasing it as a question. Clara looked up from her mending, her eyes wide. "What? Marry me," Adler repeated. "I love you, Clara. I want to spend the rest of my life with you, building a home here, growing old together. Marry me." Clara set down her sewing with shaking hands. "Are you sure?" "We have only known each other for 2 months." "I have never been more sure of anything," Adler said. "Time does not matter. I knew the first day I saw you in that garden that you were someone special, and every day since has just confirmed it. You are strong and determined and kind, and I love you more than I knew it was possible to love someone. So yes, I am sure. Marry me." Tears streamed down Clara's face, but she was smiling so hard it looked like it hurt. "Yes, yes, of course I will marry you." Adler crossed the small cabin in 2 strides and pulled her into his arms, kissing her deeply. She melted into him, her hands fisting in his shirt, and for a long moment the world outside ceased to exist. There was only the two of them, two broken people who had found wholeness in each other. They were married a week later in a simple ceremony at the small church in Council Bluffs. Clara wore her mother's wedding dress, carefully preserved and only slightly yellowed with age, and Adler wore the new coat she had made him. The whole settlement turned out, even those who had been skeptical of the mountain man who had appeared so suddenly in their midst. The preacher was an elderly man named Reverend Thomas, who had known Clara's parents. He spoke about love and commitment and the challenges of frontier life, about how marriage was both a joy and a partnership, and how the strongest marriages were the ones built on mutual respect and shared hardship. When Adler slipped a simple gold band onto Clara's finger, a ring he had bought with the last of his savings, she cried. And when Clara promised to love and honor him for the rest of her days, Adler felt something in his chest that had been frozen for 5 years finally, completely thaw. The celebration afterward was modest but heartfelt. Neighbors brought food to share, and there was music and dancing in the church hall. Adler was not much of a dancer, but he held Clara close and swayed with her, not caring if they were following the rhythm correctly. All that mattered was having her in his arms, knowing that she was his and he was hers. Mrs. Patterson approached them during a break in the dancing, her expression somewhat sheepish. "I owe you both an apology," she said. "I made assumptions about you, Mr. Harlow, based on nothing but gossip and prejudice. It is clear to anyone with eyes that you care deeply for Clara and that she is happy. I am sorry for my harsh words." "Apology accepted," Adler said, offering his hand. "Mrs. Patterson shook it, then surprised him by pulling Clara into a hug. "Your parents would be so proud of you," she told Clara. "You have shown such strength these past 2 years and you have found yourself a good man. I am glad you did not give up." Clara hugged her back, more tears falling. She seemed to cry more when she was happy than when she was sad, Adler had noticed. "Thank you. That means a lot to me." That night, Clara moved into the cabin as Adler's wife, and he moved in from the shed where he had been sleeping for propriety's sake. The bed was small, but they did not mind. They lay tangled together in the darkness, talking softly about their plans and their dreams, about the life they were going to build together. "I never thought I could be this happy again," Adler admitted, his fingers threading through Clara's unbound hair. "After Mary died, I thought that part of my life was over, that I had used up my chance at love." "Love is not limited," Clara said. "I think we get as many chances as we are brave enough to take. You could have ridden right past my garden that day. You could have helped me plant the seeds and then left, but you stayed. You were brave enough to take a chance on me, on us." "Best decision I ever made," Adler murmured, kissing her forehead, "though I think you were the brave one. You let a complete stranger into your life, trusted me to help you when you had every reason to be suspicious." "I saw your kindness," Clara said, "and your strength, and something in your eyes that matched something in mine. I think we recognized each other, Adler." Two lonely people who were tired of being alone. "Not alone anymore," Adler said. "Not alone anymore," Clara agreed. The winter that followed was long and cold, but Adler and Clara weathered it together. They ate turnips and radishes and greens from the garden, supplemented by rabbits and grouse that Adler hunted in the woods near the settlement. They kept warm by the fire, wrapped in the quilts Clara had inherited from her mother, and they talked about everything and nothing. Adler told Clara stories about his years in the mountains, about tracking wolves through deep snow and watching the northern lights dance across the sky. Clara told him about her childhood in Council Bluffs, about helping her mother with the garden and learning to shoot from her father. They shared their griefs and their joys, their fears and their hopes, and with each story they grew closer. In the deep heart of winter, when the snow was piled high and the wind howled around the cabin, Clara told Adler she thought she might be pregnant. His reaction was complicated, joy mixed with a fear that caught him off guard. He had lost a wife and child once before. The thought of going through that again terrified him, but Clara took his face in her hands and made him look at her. "I am not Mary," she said gently. "And this baby is not your son. What happened before does not dictate what will happen now. We are going to be fine." "How can you be so sure?" Adler asked, his voice rough with emotion. "Because I have to be," Clara said. "Because fear cannot rule our lives, Adler. We have both lost too much to let the possibility of future loss keep us from embracing what we have right now." She was right, and Adler knew it. He pulled her close, pressing his hand against her still flat stomach. "I am going to protect you both," he promised. "Whatever it takes, I will keep you safe." "I know you will," Clara said, "but you also have to let yourself be happy about this. We are having a baby, Adler, our baby. That is a beautiful thing." Slowly, carefully, Adler let himself feel the joy underneath the fear. They were having a baby. He was going to be a father again, and this time he was older, wiser, better prepared. This time he had experience and resources and a community around them. And most importantly, he had Clara, who was strong and healthy and determined to survive. As winter loosened its grip and spring began to creep in, they prepared for the planting season. Adler turned over the garden soil as soon as it was workable, mixing in more compost and the ashes from their winter fires. Clara sorted through seed packets, planning what to plant where, how to maximize their space and their yield. "We are going to need more food this year," she said, one hand resting on her growing belly. "Both for the three of us and to sell. If we can get a good harvest, we might be able to afford that milk cow we talked about." "We will get a good harvest," Adler said confidently. "We know what we are doing now, and we are doing it together." They planted in early May, working side by side just as they had the previous fall. But this time there was no desperation, no fear of failure. This time they planted with hope and confidence, knowing that they had the knowledge and the partnership to succeed. The wheat Adler had planted in the fall came up thick and green, waving in the spring breeze like a promise. They added more vegetables this year, expanding the garden to include beans and peas and squash. Adler built trellises for the climbing plants and staked the tomatoes. Clara insisted on trying even though the growing season was short. As Clara's pregnancy progressed, Adler took on more of the physical work, insisting that she rest even though she protested. He tended the garden every morning, checking for pests and ensuring everything had adequate water. He hunted and fished to supplement their diet, wanting to make sure Clara had plenty to eat for the baby's sake. The neighbors noticed the change in both of them. Clara glowed with happiness and health, her earlier struggles forgotten in the abundance of their new life together. And Adler, the gruff mountain man who had arrived in Council Bluffs the previous year, had transformed into a devoted husband and soon-to-be father, his love for Clara evident in every gentle gesture. In early August, as the garden reached its peak productivity, Clara went into labor. Adler sent for the midwife, Mrs. Hutchins, and then spent the longest night of his life pacing outside the cabin while Clara labored inside. He could hear her cries through the walls, and each one felt like a knife to his heart. Memories of Mary's death haunted him, the fear that history was about to repeat itself nearly overwhelming. But when dawn broke and Mrs. Hutchins opened the cabin door with a wide smile, Adler knew that this time the story was different. "You have a son," the midwife announced. And your wife is tired but well. Go meet your boy." Adler practically ran into the cabin. Clara was propped up in bed, sweaty and exhausted but radiantly happy with a tiny bundle in her arms. She looked up at him with tears in her eyes. "Adler, meet your son." He approached slowly, almost afraid to look, but when Clara pulled back the blanket to reveal a red-faced, squalling infant, Adler felt his heart expand in a way he had not known was possible. The baby was perfect, all 10 fingers and 10 toes, with a shock of dark hair and lungs that clearly worked just fine. "Can I hold him?" Adler asked, his voice barely a whisper. Clara transferred the baby to his arms, and Adler cradled his son with the careful reverence of someone handling the most precious thing in the world. The baby quieted at his touch, tiny eyes blinking open to reveal a dark blue gaze that seemed to look right through him. "What should we name him?" Clara asked. Adler thought for a moment, then said, "What about James, after your father?" Clara's eyes filled with fresh tears. "Yes, James Harlow, it is perfect." They spent the rest of the day in a haze of exhausted joy, taking turns holding James and marveling at the miracle they had created. Adler could not stop staring at his son, could not stop touching his tiny hands and feet, assuring himself that this was real, that his family was safe and whole. Over the following weeks, they settled into the rhythms of life with a newborn. Clara recovered her strength while Adler took over all the household duties in addition to tending the garden. He harvested vegetables and sold the surplus in town, building up their savings. He chopped wood for the coming winter and made plans to expand the cabin before next summer. Neighbors came by with gifts and advice, and the women of the settlement took turns helping Clara with the baby and the housework. Mrs. Patterson proved particularly helpful, her earlier skepticism replaced with genuine affection for the little family. She brought meals and baby clothes her own children had outgrown, and she sat with Clara on difficult days, offering the kind of practical wisdom that only came from experience. As summer turned to fall, the garden continued to produce. They harvested wheat and stored it in sacks, enough to last them through the winter with plenty left to sell. The vegetables were abundant, and Clara spent long hours preserving them, canning and pickling and drying so that nothing went to waste. One evening in September, almost exactly a year after Adler had first found Clara crying in her garden, they stood together looking at the abundant rows of healthy plants. James was asleep in a sling against Clara's chest, and the setting sun painted everything gold and amber. "Do you remember what this looked like a year ago?" Clara asked softly. "I do," Adler said. "Dead plants and broken dreams. And now look at it. Look at what we built together." Adler wrapped his arm around her shoulders, careful not to disturb the sleeping baby. "I was just passing through. I was not supposed to stay." "But you did," Clara said, leaning into him. "You saw someone who needed help and you stopped. You planted new seeds with me, Adler, not just in the garden but in my life, in our lives." "You did the same for me," Adler said. "I was half dead inside, going through the motions of living without really feeling anything. But then, I saw you kneeling in this garden and something in me woke up. You gave me a reason to come back to life." Clara turned in his arms, looking up at him with such love that it took his breath away. "We saved each other." "We did," Adler agreed. He kissed her softly, mindful of the baby between them. "And we are going to keep saving each other every day for the rest of our lives." As the first stars began to appear in the darkening sky, they walked back to their cabin together, a family united by love and determination, and the simple act of planting seeds in stubborn soil. They had both known profound loss, had both faced the kind of hardship that broke weaker people. But they had found each other in the midst of their struggles, and together They had built something beautiful from the ruins of their old lives. The winter that followed was their second together, and it was markedly different from the first. Where the previous winter had been about survival and discovery, this one was about contentment and growth. James thrived, growing chubby and happy, his laughter filling the small cabin with joy. Adler and Clara settled into their roles as parents, learning through trial and error how to soothe a crying baby and navigate sleepless nights. Adler proved to be a devoted father, surprisingly gentle with his tiny son despite his rough exterior. He would spend hours holding James, singing him old songs he remembered from his childhood and telling him stories about the mountains and the wilderness. Clara would watch them together, her heart so full she sometimes thought it might burst. As winter gave way to spring, they began planning their second major planting season together. This time they were even more ambitious, adding a section for corn and expanding their wheat field. Adler built a proper chicken coop, and they acquired 6 laying hens that would provide eggs and eventually meat. The homestead was starting to feel established, like a real working farm rather than just a cabin with a garden. When James was old enough to sit up on his own, Clara would bring him out to the garden while she worked, letting him play in the dirt nearby while she tended the plants. Adler would join them during breaks from his own work, and they would sit together as a family, James between them, watching the sun move across the sky. "I want more of this," Clara said one afternoon, gesturing broadly to encompass everything around them. "More children, more land, more life." "Then we will have more," Adler promised. "As much as you want. We will build the biggest, happiest family in Council Bluffs." Clara laughed and leaned against him. "Maybe not the biggest, but definitely the happiest." True to his word, Adler began planning an addition to the cabin. He wanted to add 2 more rooms, one for children and one for storage, with a proper loft above for additional sleeping space. It was an ambitious project that would take multiple seasons to complete, but he had time and determination, and a reason to see it through. The community had fully accepted them by this point. Adler was no longer viewed with suspicion, but rather as a valuable member of the settlement, someone who could be counted on to help neighbors with difficult tasks, and who always had good advice about crops and livestock. Clara had regained the standing her family had held before her parents' deaths, and she was often called upon to help other women with their gardens or to sit with new mothers. When James was 13 months old, Clara discovered she was pregnant again. This time there was no fear mixed with the joy, only excitement about expanding their family. Adler built a proper cradle during the long winter evenings, carving elaborate designs into the headboard. Clara sewed tiny clothes and blankets, preparing for the new arrival. Their second child, a daughter they named Sarah after Adler's mother, was born in the early spring of 1854. She came into the world with a lusty cry and a full head of blonde hair that looked nothing like either parent. Clara joked that she must have gotten it from some distant relative, and Adler just laughed and said she was perfect no matter where the blonde hair came from. With 2 young children, life became even busier. But it was the kind of busy that fed the soul rather than draining it. Adler would work in the fields with James strapped to his back, teaching his son about plants and soil and the rhythms of farming. Clara would nurse Sarah while supervising the older boys' attempts to help with chores. In the evenings, they would gather as a family, Adler reading aloud from the few books they owned while Clara mended clothes and the children drowsed in her lap. The garden continued to thrive year after year. They experimented with new crops, succeeding sometimes and failing others, but always learning. The wheat harvest was consistently good, providing both food and income. They finally got their milk cow, a gentle beast named Buttercup who provided rich cream and butter. Chickens multiplied into a proper flock. The homestead prospered in ways Clara had once thought impossible. On the third anniversary of the day Adler had found Clara crying in her garden, they held a small celebration. James was 3 years old and full of energy, running through the abundant rows of plants while Sarah, at 18 months, toddled after him with determined steps. Clara and Adler sat on the porch they had added to the cabin, watching their children play. "You ever regret it?" Clara asked. "Giving up your mountain cabin, your solitary life?" Adler did not even have to think about his answer. Not for a single second. That life was about hiding from pain. This life is about embracing joy. There is no comparison. "I am glad," Clara said, "because I cannot imagine doing any of this without you. You are the foundation of everything we have built here." "We are the foundation," Adler corrected. "This only works because we are partners, because we support each other. I could not do this alone any more than you could." Clara rested her head on his shoulder, and they sat in comfortable silence, watching the sun set over their flourishing garden. James had caught a butterfly and was showing it to his sister, who clapped her chubby hands in delight. The chickens were settling into their coop for the night. Buttercup lowed softly from the small barn Adler had built the previous summer. Everything was peaceful, productive, full of life. "I want to tell you something," Clara said after a while. "Something I have been thinking about a lot lately." "What is it?" Adler asked, hearing the serious tone in her voice. "That day you found me in the garden, I had been praying, asking God to either send me help or give me the courage to give up and leave. I was at the absolute end of my rope, Adler. And then you appeared, like an answer to a prayer I had barely dared to speak." She lifted her head to look at him. "You saved my life that day, not just by giving me seeds, but by giving me hope, by showing me that I was not alone and that things could get better." Adler felt his throat tighten with emotion. "You saved mine too. I did not realize how empty my life had become until I met you. I was existing, not living. You reminded me what it meant to truly be alive, to care about something beyond my own survival." "We were supposed to find each other," Clara said. "I believe that. Out of all the places you could have been traveling, all the possible paths you could have taken, you ended up here, in Council Bluffs on that specific day at exactly the right moment. That was not coincidence. That was fate." "Maybe you are right," Adler said. He had never been particularly spiritual, but even he had to admit there was something almost miraculous about the way things had unfolded. "Either way, I am grateful for it. Grateful for you, for our children, for this life we have built together." They sat together until full darkness fell, until Clara reluctantly said they needed to get the children inside and ready for bed. As Adler scooped up Sarah and took James by the hand, he looked back at the garden one more time. The plants were just dark shapes now, barely visible in the starlight, but he knew they were there. Knew they were healthy and strong, growing and thriving just like his family. It all started with seeds, he thought. Seeds planted in desperate soil by desperate hands, watered with tears and sweat and hope. And from those seeds had grown not just vegetables and grain, but an entire life. A family. A future. Years passed in the steady rhythm of seasons. Spring planting, summer growth, fall harvest, winter rest. Children grew and more children came. A third baby, another son they named Thomas, arrived when James was 5 and Sarah was 3. Then twin girls, Alice and Emma, when the family was already feeling stretched thin by the demands of running a growing farm. But somehow they made it work. Adler and Clara supporting each other through the exhausting years of young children and endless chores. The cabin grew too, room by room, until it was a proper house with space for everyone. Adler proved to be a talented carpenter, and he built sturdy furniture to fill their home. Clara's garden expanded to nearly an acre, producing enough food to feed their large family with plenty left over to sell at the market that met weekly in Council Bluffs. James grew into a serious boy who loved working alongside his father, learning everything Adler could teach him about farming and animal husbandry. Sarah was clever and quick, with a talent for numbers that meant she kept track of the farm's accounts from the time she was 8 years old. Thomas was the family adventurer, always climbing trees and exploring the woods, reminding Adler of his own younger self. And the twins were inseparable, finishing each other's sentences and seeming to communicate without words. Through it all, Adler and Clara remained the steady center of their growing family. They still made time for each other, stolen moments on the porch after the children were in bed, or quiet conversations while working side by side in the garden. Their love had deepened over the years, becoming something solid and unshakable, the bedrock on which everything else was built. When Adler turned 35, Clara threw him a surprise party, inviting all their neighbors and friends. It was a boisterous affair with too much food and loud music and children running everywhere. At one point, Adler found himself standing at the edge of the celebration, just watching, and Mrs. Patterson came up beside him. "You have done well for yourself, Mr. Harlow," she said. "I will admit, I did not think you would last when you first arrived, but you have proved me wrong in the best possible way." "Thank you," Adler said, "though I could not have done any of it without Clara." "That is true of all good marriages," Mrs. Patterson said. "The successful ones are the partnerships, where both people work together toward common goals. You two have built something special here." Adler watched Clara across the yard, laughing at something one of their neighbors had said while simultaneously keeping an eye on Thomas, who was attempting to climb onto the chicken coop roof. She looked happy and healthy, her face glowing with contentment. She had put on weight over the years, her body softening with the births of 5 children, but to Adler she was more beautiful now than she had been at 22. She was his wife, his partner, the mother of his children, and he loved her more than he had ever thought possible. As if feeling his gaze, Clara looked over and their eyes met across the crowded yard. She smiled at him, that special smile that was just for him, and mouthed the words, "I love you." Adler smiled back and returned the sentiment, and even from a distance he could see her eyes grow a little misty. 15 years after the day Adler had found Clara crying in her garden, they stood together in that same space, now expanded and thriving. It was harvest time, and the garden was at its most abundant. Corn stood tall in neat rows, tomatoes hung heavy on their vines, and squash sprawled across the ground in every direction. Their children worked alongside them, James at 17 nearly as tall as his father and just as muscular, Sarah at 15 already fielding marriage proposals that she handled with pragmatic efficiency, Thomas at 12 full of energy and enthusiasm, and the twins at 9 racing each other to see who could pick beans faster. "I cannot believe how much things have changed," Clara said, pulling a particularly large carrot from the ground and holding it up for inspection. "Do you remember what this garden looked like when we met?" "I remember you kneeling right about there," Adler said, pointing to a spot now occupied by a thriving tomato plant, "crying like your heart was broken." "It was broken," Clara said. "Or at least I thought it was. I had lost everything, or so it seemed. My parents, my crops, my hope for the future." "And then a scruffy mountain man showed up and refused to let you give up," Adler said with a grin. "The best thing that ever happened to me," Clara said. She walked over to him and wrapped her arms around his waist, not caring that they were both filthy from a day of harvesting. You planted new seeds with me, Adler, and not just in this garden. You planted hope and love and possibility. You gave me a future when I thought I did not have one. Adler kissed the top of her head, breathing in the familiar scent of her hair mixed with the smell of rich earth and growing things. We gave each other a future. This is ours, Clara. Everything we have, everything we are, we built it together. Together, Clara agreed. Always together. James called out that he had found a pumpkin big enough to win a prize at the county fair, and Sarah was arguing with him about whether size or shape mattered more, and Thomas was trying to juggle tomatoes while the twins cheered him on. It was chaos, beautiful and messy and perfect, and Adler would not have changed a single thing. That night, after the children were finally asleep and the house was quiet, Adler and Clara sat on their porch as they had countless times before. The autumn air was cool and crisp, promising frost in the coming weeks. Soon they would need to bring in the last of the harvest and prepare for winter. But for now, they just sat together, hands linked, watching the stars appear one by one in the darkening sky. "Do you ever think about where we will be in another 15 years?" Clara asked. "James will be married with children of his own, probably. Sarah, too. The others will be nearly grown. We will be grandparents, Adler." "Grandparents," Adler repeated, testing out the word. "I suppose we will be. Though I do not feel old enough for that." "We are not old," Clara protested. "We are just well-seasoned." Adler laughed at that. "Well-seasoned, I like that." He squeezed her hand. "Wherever we are in 15 years, whatever we are doing, I know it will be good as long as we are together. That is all that matters to me. Not the farm or the money or any of it, just you." "Us." "Us," Clara echoed. "The family we made from nothing but determination and love." They sat in comfortable silence for a while longer, and then Clara said, "I want to plant something new next spring. Something we have never tried before. Maybe grapes for wine, or maybe an orchard, apples and pears. Something that will take years to mature, but that will be here for our grandchildren." "An orchard," Adler said, warming to the idea. "I like that. We could plant it on that south-facing slope, the one that gets sun all day. It would be perfect." "Then that is what we will do," Clara said decisively. "One more new beginning, one more planting." "There will always be new plantings," Adler said. "New seasons, new growth." "That is what we do, Clara. We plant seeds and we nurture them and we watch them grow into something beautiful. Whether those seeds are vegetables or trees or children or love, it is all the same work, really. The work of building a life." Clara leaned her head on his shoulder, and Adler wrapped his arm around her, holding her close. They had planted so many seeds together over the years. Some had flourished beyond their wildest dreams, while others had failed despite their best efforts. But they had never stopped trying, never stopped believing that the next planting might be the one that changed everything. And sometimes, like that desperate day 15 years ago when a weeping woman and a wandering mountain man had knelt together in dead soil and planted hope in the form of turnip seeds, those plantings did change everything. They changed lives and hearts and futures. They transformed loneliness into love and despair into joy. As the years continued to unfold, the Harlow family became a cornerstone of Council Bluffs. Their farm was known throughout the territory for its productivity and the quality of its crops. Neighbors came to Adler for advice on farming techniques, and to Clara for help with preserving food and managing households. Their children grew into capable adults who carried forward the lessons they had learned from their parents. When Iowa became a state in 1846, and when the settlement continued to grow and prosper, Adler and Clara were part of that growth. They helped build a school and contributed to the construction of a larger church. They opened their home to travelers and new settlers, offering advice and assistance to those just starting out. But through all the changes and all the years, that garden remained the heart of everything. Every spring they would stand together at the edge of it, planning and dreaming and preparing for another season of growth. And every fall they would harvest the fruits of their labor, always grateful for the abundance, never taking it for granted. On their 20th wedding anniversary, their children threw them a party that was even more elaborate than the one Clara had organized for Adler's 35th birthday. James and his wife, a lovely young woman named Catherine, had just had their first child, making Adler and Clara official grandparents. Sarah had married a merchant from Omaha but lived close enough to visit often. Thomas, at 17, was already planning to head west to try his hand at ranching. And the twins, now 14, were inseparable as ever, already talking about opening a bakery together someday. At one point during the party, Adler pulled Clara away from the crowd and led her out to the garden. It was late October, past the main harvest season, but there were still winter squash ripening on their vines and the last of the kale and spinach still producing in the cooler weather. "You remember the day we met?" Adler asked, standing in almost the exact spot where he had first seen her kneeling in tears. "Every detail," Clara said. "I was so lost, Adler, so convinced that I was going to fail, that I had no future. And then you appeared, this huge stranger with kind eyes, and you refused to let me give up." "You did not need me to save you," Adler said. "You would have figured it out on your own eventually, but I am glad I got to be part of your journey." "Our journey," Clara corrected. "It stopped being just mine the moment you got down in the dirt and started planting seeds with me. From that moment on, we were in this together." Adler pulled her into his arms, holding her close the way he had done thousands of times over their 20 years together. She fit against him perfectly, her head tucked under his chin, her arms wrapped around his waist. They had weathered so much together. Hard winters and failed crops, sick children and tight finances, disagreements and disappointments. But through it all, their love had remained constant, growing deeper and stronger with each passing year. "I love you," he said, the words still as meaningful as they had been the first time he had spoken them. "I have loved you since the day I found you weeping in this garden, and I will love you until the day I die." "I love you too," Clara said. "You gave me everything, Adler. Hope and home and family. A life I never dreamed was possible. You planted new seeds with me in every sense of those words." They stood together in their garden as the sun set, painting the sky in shades of orange and gold. Behind them, they could hear the sounds of their family celebrating, laughter and music drifting across the yard. Their children and grandchild, their friends and neighbors, all the people who made up the life they had built. It had all started here in this patch of earth that had once held nothing but withered dreams. But from that failure had grown something beautiful and enduring. A garden, a home, a family, a love that had transformed two broken people into something whole. Adler and Clara walked back to the celebration hand in hand, ready to rejoin their family, ready to keep living the life they had created together. There would be more plantings in the years to come, more seasons of growth and harvest, more challenges to face and overcome, more joys to celebrate. But no matter what the future brought, they would face it together, just as they had faced everything else. Two people united by love and determination, and the simple act of kneeling together in the dirt and planting seeds with hopeful hands. That was their story, their legacy, their gift to each other and to the world. And when they were old and gray, when their children had children of their own and the original garden had been expanded and redesigned countless times, Adler and Clara would still come back to this spot on autumn evenings. They would stand together in the fading light, remembering that desperate day when everything had changed, when a mountain man had found a woman kneeling in her garden weeping and had chosen to stay and help her plant new seeds. Those seeds had grown into a life neither of them could have imagined, but one that was exactly what they both needed. A life built on partnership and love, on hard work and hope, on the understanding that sometimes the best things grow from the most unlikely beginnings. Their story was one of redemption and second chances, of finding love when you least expected it, and building something lasting from the ruins of old dreams. It was a story that would be told by their descendants for generations, about how a mountain man and a farmer's daughter met in a failed garden and planted the seeds of a love that would endure long after they were gone. But for now, surrounded by their family on their 20th anniversary, they simply held each other close and gave thanks for the day their paths had crossed, for the courage to take a chance on each other, and for every precious moment they had shared since that fateful afternoon when everything had changed in a failing garden in Council Bluffs, Iowa. The end.